Hi folks, welcome back. Sorry this has been a couple of weeks longer than planned. I had all but lost my voice there for a couple of weeks. I think I may have caught bronchitis. Still a bit scratchy today. The tale I want to share today is a little something I wrote about on the blog page, historyandimagination.com, a little while back. The original written piece had come in 4 parts. I have done a little bit of a rewrite on the script while I've been off sans voice, but I will start where I started, on the blog. On the couch one night, watching old episodes of The Dick Cavett Show on YouTube. It was a particular episode which took me down a rabbit hole of an incident that I knew of, but had not given a lot of thought about for a very long time. Now, if you don't know the show I'm referring to, Dick Cavett is a comedian, a writer, and a former host of a series of eponymous talk shows from the late 60s through to the mid-1980s, with the occasional special that came after that. Smart as they come, insightful, charismatic, and possessing a brilliant turn of phrase, Dick Cavett is really quite an interesting watch, in my opinion. Several of his interviews with the likes of Jimi Hendrix, John Lennon, and Marlon Brando became definitive works on those artists. On the night in question, I was watching an episode filmed in 1972, which included vignettes taken backstage at Madison Square Garden. Dick was there to interview the Rolling Stones, arguably the biggest band in the world at the time. This was their first tour back in the USA since 1969. Dick Cavett is sitting next to the Rolling Stones' bassist, Bill Wyman, and he clearly has a topic in mind. Cavett asks Wyman, "What's running through your nervous system right now? Are you worried? Are you scared? Do matinees give you the willies or anything?" Wyman replies he's just tired. Cavett asks him, would they play so many concerts so closely together in the future? Wyman replies they have done this many times before. Cavett follows up, "You're still protected from the..." Wyman interrupts. My guess he doesn't want to talk about what they're protected from. He says he's just a little bit tired this tour. "Not done yet," Cavett asks. "I wonder what's happened on this tour that made it this way." Wyman replies, quote, "Just the energy." Dick Cavett pivots, changing tack. He asks Bill Wyman if the age range in the audience has changed. It has widened, if anything. Talks a little about Tom Jones and middle-aged ladies. Middle-aged ladies may like the Welsh crooner, but Wyman suggests the feeling may well be mutual. Is Bill a chain smoker? Would he go back to school if the Rolling Stones came to an end? Who are all the children backstage? Bill Wyman relaxes into the conversation. Not done yet, however. Cavett, quote, "Has there been anything on this trip that scared you, or any bad moments when you were worried about something that was going to happen? Menacing." Wyman, after a drawn-out Freudian pause. "No, just seeing the cops beat kids up scares me sometimes, you know?" Back to Cavett. "Was there much of that this time?" Wyman. "Not as much as usual, but we have seen it. They seem to grab guys out of the audience. Take them out, they go through a whole thing on the way with sticks, and it's pretty rough, you know. They don't deserve it." Dick Cavett asks if too much security is a problem. Wyman replies that sometimes they, quote, "get up front and cause trouble." Then Dick Cavett moves in, subtly allowing Bill Wyman to answer with a de-individuated "guys in the group," rather than a more confrontational "you." Subtly, but surely, as he knows he has Wyman now on the hook. "Do you guys in the group talk about Altamont ever, and what happened there, or has it faded?" Wyman replies, "We talk about it, yes, but I'd sooner forget about it, you know. It was a very unfortunate thing. It was the last show of the tour, and we weren't going to do it. It was just a live concert. A free concert that was set up a few days before, and..." Long Freudian pause. "I mean, there was 300,000 people there, and there was only 30 people fighting. I mean, almost all the audience never even saw it, didn't even know what was going on, you know?" Now, needless to say, knowing something about the Altamont free concert, this did make me jump right out of my seat. Honestly, from a business perspective, I can understand why you might want to downplay this. You would not want, quote, "what was going on," end quote, to define your band. If 80s glam rock band Great White came to town, would you want to go and see them? If you answered yes, if a nationally syndicated reporter started dredging up the February 20th, 2003 Station nightclub concert, where malfunctioning pyrotechnics set fire to the club, killing 100 people and injuring a further 230, would you feel any different? Are you quite so keen to go see Ariana Grande if the reporter takes to the interview talking about the 2017 Manchester Arena bombing which injured over 800 people? Country music fans? Who was up to seeing Sugarland if the interviewer is hyping the 2011 Indiana State Fair gig where the stage collapsed, killing 7 and injuring 50 more? These things can make you stop and think at least, right? But a man was stabbed and beaten to death in front of you after a brutal, vicious day which seemed more like a pitched battle at times than a concert. How could Bill Wyman be so nonchalant about, to quote, what happened? One of his cohort, guitarist Keith Richards, carried a .38 caliber pistol with him at all times in the 1972 tour. Members of some of the other bands talked about it for years after, the Grateful Dead's Jerry Garcia commenting on one documentary I can remember vaguely as a kid, something to the effect of, "It was a fine day in hell." Today, dear listeners, I want to share with you what I found. Today's episode, Season 1, Episode 4 of Tales of History and Imagination, Altamont, the Ballad of Meredith Hunter. Okay, so what was the Altamont Speedway Free Festival? Held at Altamont Speedway, Northern California, on December 6, 1969, and meant as a smaller version of Woodstock, several acts were set to play besides the Rolling Stones. Santana, Jefferson Airplane, the Flying Burrito Brothers, Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young were all on the bill too. The Grateful Dead was supposed to be the penultimate act before the Rolling Stones helicoptered in, but they had declined to play. Marty Balin, vocalist for Jefferson Airplane getting punched out by security, was the final straw for them. Jerry Garcia, frontman of the Grateful Dead, commented in a British interview in 1970 that Woodstock and Altamont were two sides of the same coin. Quote, "It was like two ways that kind of expression can go of a huge number of people and of no rules. One of the ways, obviously, can go to a terrible bummer like Altamont, and one of the other ways is to an immensely enjoyable scene like Woodstock. And they both had their extremes, and they were both sort of characterized by this heaviness, this sort of historical heaviness." End quote. I can get that, to be honest. To my mind, Woodstock, August 15th to 18th, 1969, seemed the cultural zenith of the 60s counterculture peace and love movement. The poster, 3 days of peace and music. A bird perched on a guitar neck, it seemed so apt. Altamont then had to be its nadir, a scene out of Dante's Inferno. Abandon all hope, ye who enter here. But there were certain similarities, and it's worth saying a little about this first. Now when you think big open-air concerts in 1969, people generally do think of Woodstock, named after the town in Ulster, New York. Woodstock actually happened 43 miles southwest on a 600-acre dairy farm in Bethel, New York. But the advertising had already gone out. They had quickly had to find a new spot. And anyway, Bethel, in my opinion, doesn't have quite the same ring to it. 32 acts performed at Woodstock. 400,000 people attended. Despite the occasional bursts of rain, people danced, people got high, some involuntarily. Some people got naked and put flowers in their hair. It took on the aura of being the high point of the hippy counterculture movement. Of course, some of this is us looking through rose-tinted glasses of the 3-day concert. On the morning of the 16th, 17-year-old Raymond Mizsak was accidentally run over by a tractor on its way to empty the portaloos. He died before he could be airlifted to a local hospital. Were it not for a local company bringing in tons of granola in the last minute, there wouldn't have been any food. There was a ratio of 1 toilet to every 883 people. The traffic jam caused by the concert is still on record as one of the 10 worst traffic jams of all time. Pete Townshend of The Who beat up a stage invader with his guitar. In the aftermath, the people of Bethel got rid of a town supervisor for letting the concert go ahead at the first opportunity. They were not happy with all that peace, love and music. They, at least of all, were not happy with the huge disruption to the area. But all that said, it can be remembered as an epoch-defining moment. A few of the musicians playing the event were clearly buzzing from the experience. So much that, soon after Woodstock, Jefferson Airplane's Jorma Kaukonen and Spencer Dryden got together to talk about staging a similar gig, on the West Coast this time. While spitballing ideas, the idea came up to include the Grateful Dead, another band who had played Woodstock, and the Rolling Stones. Now, if anybody is unsure, the Rolling Stones were at the time arguably the second biggest band in the world, behind the Beatles. Both bands signed up. The Stones likely because they had been criticised for the high ticket prices on their then-current 1969 tour of the USA, and this was to be a free concert after all. The Grateful Dead, well, they had gigged incessantly, notching up over 2,300 concerts in their career. They had played the other two big, open-air concerts of the 1960s. 1967's Monterey Pop Festival, and Woodstock. They had also had, by most accounts, a shocker of a set at Woodstock, so maybe this was to be their atonement for that. With very little time to get the concert together, the organisers scrambled to find a venue. San Jose State University in California had a large practice field that had been used for concerts before, but the university were not interested in hosting the show. San Francisco's Golden Gate Park had been mooted, and had been sent out to the other acts as a likely venue. There was a scheduling problem, however. On the night of 6 December, Keyser Stadium, located in one corner of the park, was booked for a football game between the San Francisco 49ers and the Chicago Bears. If you are wondering, the 49ers beat the Bears 42-21. This presented a logistical nightmare to have two such large activities going on there at the same time. Sears Point Raceway in Sonoma, California looked promising, but they ran into two problems there. First, the owners wanted $300,000 up front. Second, the owners were Filmways Incorporated, a film and TV production company known best as the creators of CBS's rural content. Mr. Ed, Petticoat Junction, The Beverly Hillbillies, and my personal favourite, Green Acres. Filmways also wanted to distribute and film the concert, but the Rolling Stones were filming a documentary of their own that time, would later be released as Gimme Shelter, so that was a no-go. On the 4th of December 1969, Altamont Speedway, a motor racing track in Tracy, California, was suggested. Perhaps feeling beggars can't be choosers, or should that be you can't always get what you want, sorry, bad pun intended. Altamont became the site for the gig. Logistically, it really was far from perfect, and we will get into this after this break. Hi all, welcome back. So, how can you describe the planning process for the Altamont Free Concert? What were all the ingredients in this recipe for disaster? Let's see. First, add a hazy, dusty day hanging over a drab, colourless landscape. Picture Woodstock in your mind's eye, out at Max Yasker's farm. It's lush and verdant till the sky opens up, then it turned terribly muddy. But there was something very Age of Aquarius about it. People tuning in to Mother Nature, to love, music and narcotics. If you are a young searcher looking to find Rousseau's hypothetical state of nature before the world had become corrupt, you could almost imagine it amongst these buzzed-out, drenched, half-naked kids on that lush green farm. Altamont, not really. Grace Slick of Jefferson Airplane described the mood, to quote, "The vibes are bad, something was really peculiar. Not particularly bad, just real peculiar. It was that sort of kind of hazy, abrasive day," end quote. And yeah, looked it. Check out the photos on the blog site. Or Google it. I'll wait a second. Next, toss in a sprinkling of next to no preparation. With less than 2 days to prepare, there's nowhere near enough by way of either toilets or medical tents. The stage could not be built up to a reasonable height, so it sat just 4 feet off the ground, but also sat in a dip. One could imagine, as the day went on, tired legs and gravity alone might pull people closer and closer to the stage. With no security barriers to keep the concertgoers out, someone had taken a ball of string and ran a single piece of string. Not rope, not a really thick piece of string, just some average twine, chest high in front of the stage. In the first minutes this had been broken down. To make up for the lack of barriers of security, a local chapter of the Hells Angels were placed out front and centre to stop people getting too close. To start with, they would push people back, but over time this would escalate. Now I should point out the Hells Angels were hardly new to this kind of work. This particular chapter had done security for many of the acts on the bill before, without incident. However, their agreement to handle security this time was really loose. The then Rolling Stones tour manager Sam Cutler stated, quote, "The only agreement there ever was, the Angels would make sure nobody tampered with the generators. There is a good chance they had no idea how much they would be required to do at this poorly set out venue. They also agreed to be paid in $500 worth of beer to be provided to them on the day, around $3,400 now. A fair amount really if provided in bulk, say in kegs. Add the following ingredient, an increasingly inebriated group of bikers feeling imposed upon way beyond what they thought they had originally intended to do. Now add to this mix a massive miscalculation. The original expectation was that 100,000 people, a pretty large crowd for sure, would show up. Over 300,000 showed up. Stretched resources would suddenly be stretched well beyond breaking point. One way in which this would play out is the Hells Angels having to call in reinforcements. The reinforcements had nowhere to park their bikes but at the side of the stage. More on that later. Another way this led to disaster, well, I should mention the final ingredient, drugs and alcohol. Now I've already just mentioned the Hells Angels' payment in beer. By all accounts, many of them were drunk early on in the day and made impaired decisions. Also early on in the day, a large amount of LSD, laced with speed, had gotten passed through the crowd. The crowd was full of people tripping all over the place, but the speed was giving many of them really bad trips. With far too few medical staff at the venue, treatment was slow, and the preferred treatment at the time, the antipsychotic drug Thorazine, ran out early on, leaving many concertgoers strung out and increasingly paranoid in a hazy, dusty scene. Now mix all those ingredients. Now describing what happened. Santana played first. Their set went with a few minor incidents, a little bit of pushing between the crowd and the Hells Angels, but nothing massive. Jefferson Airplane had barely started when a flurry of violence broke out front. Rumour has it that a concertgoer had knocked over one of the motorbikes at the edge of the stage. The Hells Angels retaliated in a flurry of punches, then by bringing out pull cues and striking audience members. Vocalist Marty Balin jumped into the crowd to try and cool things down, only to be knocked unconscious by a gang member. Guitarist Paul Kantner grabbed a microphone and addressed the crowd. Quote, "Hey man, I'd like to mention the Hells Angels just smashed Marty Balin in the face and knocked him out for a bit." Sarcastically, he addressed security. "I'd like to thank you for that." A brooding-looking Hells Angel by the name of Bill Fritsch. I should mention as an aside, when I published the blog on this, a few women commented on just how brooding and attractive he was. I don't know if I should be making a hero out of a guy, but still, he's an interesting guy. Himself was apparently a former hippie, a one-time San Franciscan poet, a one-time left-wing progressive, almost appeared in Kenneth Anger's cult film Lucifer Rising. The scene was cut in the final mix. And an associate of Charles Manson. Grabs a microphone and retorts, "Is this on? If you're talking to me, I'm going to talk to you." Kantner replies, "I'm not talking to you, I'm talking to the people who hit my lead singer in the head." Fritsch, "You're talking to my people." Kantner, "Right." All the while the Hells Angels trade blows of audience members in front of the stage. Kantner and Fritsch don't come to blows, but you can see the frustration, you can see the pent-up anger between the two of them. It is palpable. Santana drummer Michael Shreve reports back to the Grateful Dead what's just happened. They've decided they've seen enough. They pack up and they get the hell out of here. Everyone calmed down again while country rock act the Flying Burrito Brothers played their set. Soon after, though, violence erupted. Where early in the day medics were de-escalating bad trips, they were now dealing with a number of seriously wounded concertgoers. The injury of the day being fractured skulls. Now, to paint the Hells Angels as the only ones dishing out violence would be completely wrong. Denise Jukes, singer for cult San Franciscan rock band The Ace of Cups, an all-female band with a cult following. They opened for people like Jimi Hendrix, though didn't record their first album, if you can believe this, till 2018, while she was in attendance as a fan and 6 months pregnant. Jukes got struck by a bottle thrown from the crowd, which resulted in a fractured skull. The story has it, in her case at least, Mick Jagger personally paid for her medical bills. As the violence continued to escalate, concertgoers were beaten with pool cues and bike chains. At one point, a woman was dragged across the stage by her hair. In the midst of this carnage, a young man in a lime green suit wanders off to his car, a Ford Mustang, and pops a boot, grabbing a .22 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver. He heads back in. He came to see the Rolling Stones and no one was going to bring him down. As night set in, a helicopter carrying the Rolling Stones arrived. Their set time had been delayed by the late arrival of the future Dick Cavett Show interviewee, Bill Wyman. He'd missed the copter. Out front it looked like a bloodbath, but the Stones were going on regardless. The helicopter prepared to take off, now laden with members of Jefferson Airplane, ready to beat a hasty retreat. The Stones kicked off their set. The helicopter, now airborne, hovered for a second above the venue as a shaken Jefferson Airplane looked downwards. Journalist Joel Selvin describes the scene. Quote, "The pilot circled over the crowd for one last view of the stage. They looked down. The crowd in front of the stage spread apart before their eyes. A large, visible space opened and quickly closed up again. They watched as a mass of people spread apart and fused back together in a single, seamless movement. They had no idea they had witnessed the killing of Meredith Hunter." Just a quick break, folks. Back after this. At the Skyview Memorial Lawn Cemetery in East Vallejo, California, is a simple grave. Lot 63, Grave C. The plot holds a young man killed in December 1969, and as of 2006, when filmmaker Sam Green made a short documentary titled Lot 63, Grave C, the plot remained unmarked. It was hardly as if the young man didn't have loved ones left in the wake of his killing, but they did not have much money, and were so broken-hearted by his death they kept their distance. His mother, Alta Mae Anderson, had struggled her whole life with schizophrenia, and the killing had sent her into a tailspin. For years she turned to electroconvulsive therapy. From what I've read, she seemed a shell of her former self to her nearest and dearest after this. His sister, Dixie, could not bring herself to attend the murder case against her brother's killer. She was heavily suspicious that in the case of a white man charged with the killing of a black man, the white man would walk. A little on this later. And she did not want to go through the pain of seeing this happen. A short, solidly built Hell's Angel by the name of Alan Pissarro was tried for her brother's murder, but he would be acquitted. It was Dixie who had pled with her brother, 18-year-old Meredith Hunter, not to go to the Altamont Free Festival that day. She was not so worried about the biker gangs. It was the fact that it was on the rural edges of Alameda County, a place which seemed to her aggressive in its racial views. Keep in mind, this is set in 1969. To add just the tiniest bit of context, just 6 years prior to the concert, President John F. Kennedy had ordered the National Guard into the University of Alabama to arrest Alabama Governor George Wallace. Wallace was physically blocking the entrance of 2 black students around the same age as Hunter, who were there to complete student registration at the all-white college. Wallace had come a hair's breadth from arrest when he backed down. Just 5 years prior to Altamont, in Mississippi, 3 civil rights activists were detained and murdered while travelling through the area and enrolling black people to vote. Perhaps most pertinent in a way, and please note I'm just pulling a tiny, tiny handful of examples from a long, very disturbing history here. This concert was happening 14 years after a young boy from Chicago, Emmett Till, was kidnapped and tortured to death for daring to speak to a white woman who worked in a store. The act of miscegenation, of mingling of the races for sexual reasons, was thought bad enough by some that even an attempt by a young teen to miscegenate was an offence worthy of a lynching. The shop assistant's husband, Roy Bryant, and his friend, J.W. Milam, brutally murdered Till, and being two white men having killed a young black boy were also acquitted. I stress this case as, at the time, Hunter was dating a young white woman called Patty Breedhoft. Hunter did pay some heed to his sister, packing the Smith & Wesson revolver in the boot of his stepdad's Mustang. He drove to Patty's and the two went to the concert. As a child I'd heard he was a pimp and Patty was one of his girls. This is untrue. He was an art student. I've also heard he was way more fearless than maybe he should have been, having taken methamphetamine that day. The latter was certainly true. Picking up the tale going back to just after the Jefferson Airplane incident, a group of bikers had just rocked up through the crowd on their hogs, whizzing past Hunter and Breedhoft. They were nearby when the violence had erupted out front with Marty Balin. At this point, Patty had had enough and she went back to the car. Meredith wanted to hang around, and just prior to the Rolling Stones set, decided he would head back in to catch them. The two had words. Meredith was the more forceful of the two. He grabbed his gun, and the two made their way back to the stage. What could go wrong? In a word, everything, and it happened very, very quickly. Why all this unfolded is a little subject to guesswork. Following the incident, the president of the Oakland chapter, Ralph "Sonny" Barger, did state on KSAN Radio, San Francisco, quote, "When they started messing over the bikes, they started it," end quote. He went on to say that their bikes represented everything, their whole lives. Was this wave of violence caused because someone had tipped a bike over? Some say yes. Whatever the case, the Rolling Stones had only just got started when the Hells Angels advanced again on the crowd, like a phalanx of Greek infantry. The crowd out front dispersed. Meredith Hunter at the time had climbed atop her speaker cabinet at the side of the stage, possibly for safety. But a Hells Angel had reached up, grabbed him by the ear, and threw him down onto the ground. Hunter backpedaled as fast as he could, trying to put some distance between himself and his assailant. He drew the pistol and pointed it in the general direction of the assailant, this also having to be the direction of the stage. It was at this point that the heavy-set Alan Pissarro appeared on his left flank. Pissarro grabbed his shooting hand, disarming him, then stabbed Hunter twice in the back. Hunter stumbled. Pissarro followed him to the ground, stabbing all the way. A pack of 5 Hells Angels surrounded the fallen Hunter and laid into him, delivering a heavy beating. A screaming, distraught Breedhoft struggled to stop one of the men but was easily shrugged off. Hunter pled with them. "I wasn't going to shoot you," but the men laid into Hunter till he stopped moving. A young bystander named Paul Cox stepped up, trying to stop the assault, but he too was powerless. He did eventually manage to get Meredith Hunter away from the scene of the beating and into a medical tent. A helicopter was called in, but he'd passed away before the helicopter could arrive. All up, Meredith Hunter was one of 4 fatalities that day, although he was the only person to have been killed. All the others were all accidents. Now, post-Altamont, the zeitgeist had changed considerably. No doubt this incident was just one of several to shock the American public. The assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert F. Kennedy, April 4th and June 5th, 1968, respectively. The images coming out of Indochina and the rising death toll. Somehow I suspect the 3 million Vietnamese and the similar numbers again in Cambodia did have an effect on some. But an eventual death toll of 58,000 Americans, and a high number coming back wounded. Politicians refer to this as the Dover test when accepting they've had one too many coffins fly back into Dover Air Force Base. Well, I think the Dover test had kicked in some time back. A great many Americans, though, did see the Vietnam War as horribly unjust. In August 1969, a hippie family, led by Charles Manson, had slaughtered the Tate Party and the La Biancas. Something which in time would unravel, revealing a far bigger death toll again, and the backstory of a group intent on starting a race war, helter-skelter, as Manson referred to it. With the trial of a Chicago 7 around the corner. Long story short, but there were anti-war protesters involved in a violent battle with Mayor Richard Daley's police force outside the 1968 Democratic National Convention. And not long after the acceptance of a number of cultural icons to the 27 Club, even if that term would not be coined until the mid-1990s. It felt like things had gone from Bob Dylan's "The times they are a-changin'" to 10 years after's "I'd like to change the world, but I don't know what to do." The hippie movement and flower power faded, and the 1970s would be much darker, much edgier. Alan Pissarro would be charged with murder and brought before a jury in Alameda County. The jury saw the film footage from the day and decided Pissarro had acted in self-defense. Alan Pissarro would, mysteriously, be found drowned in the Anderson Reservoir, Morgan Hill, California, in 1985. A wad of cash totaling $10,000 on him at the time. He lays buried under an impressive gravestone, if the photo on Find a Grave is anything to go by. I couldn't find very much on Patty Breedhoft. She did give a 2005 interview to the Sunday Times, where she claimed not to have made much of her life, and of course discussed the infamous second date with Meredith Hunter. FYI, their first date was to see The Temptations. I will say this of Meredith Hunter, I think he has fantastic taste in music. The Hells Angels blamed the Rolling Stones for the outcome of the concert. Keith Richards may well have been very wise to have carried a gun with him on the 72 tour. And perhaps Bill Wyman was wise not to say too much. The Hells Angels did hatch a plot to assassinate Mick Jagger to get revenge. They got a death squad together. They got hold of a boat and they set sail for his house on Long Island. On the day a storm set in and the death squad eventually made it back to dock, feeling the worse for wear, and by all accounts lucky not to have drowned. They didn't get anywhere near Mick Jagger's house and they gave up on killing Jagger not long after this. The story made it to an FBI informant in 1985 and finally become public knowledge in 2008, when Mick Jagger himself had only just then found out how lucky he'd been. Which brings me round to Mick Jagger himself. Could he do better than Bill Wyman on the Dick Cavett Show, which started this cycle? In 1995, Rolling Stone magazine's Jan Wenner met with the Rolling Stone and asked the following, quote, "After the concert itself, when it became apparent that somebody got killed, how did you feel?" End quote. Jagger replied, "Well, awful. I mean, just awful. You feel a responsibility. How could it all have been so silly and so wrong? But I didn't think of these things that you guys thought of. You in the press, this great loss of innocence, this cathartic end of the era. I didn't feel any of that. That particular burden did not weigh on my mind. It was more how awful it was to have had this experience, and how awful it was for someone to get killed. I think it's as good a point as any to leave it." Well, thank you for tuning in, guys. We should be back in a couple of weeks' time. A little bit less croaky, a little bit less bronchial, with a new tale of history and imagination. As always, music provided by Ishtar. Their press kit, so I'm told, has a line in there from Jerry Garcia. It has been a long, strange trip. Have a great couple of weeks, people, and we'll see you back soon for more tales of history and imagination.
And often sent out in the world, abandoned to leave me till